Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight. In April of 1948, the television station that became ABC4 turned on. It was the first station in Utah and the only one at that time between Chicago and the West Coast. Needless to say, over the past 73 years, a lot has changed, but the delivery of news was always central to our station's mission. Tonight, we look at the impact of local broadcast news, what has changed, and where it might be going. Kicking off our conversation tonight is ABC4's own Craig Wirth. And Craig, thank you so much for joining us. We're glad to have you here.
Well, thank you. And I want to be clear, I wasn't here in 1948.
Okay,
but
thank
shortly
you for
thereafter,
clarifying
it seems.
that up. Craig, let's start with talking about the first newscasts that came out of our station. What were they like, and was it basically radio on television?
Well, you know, for a long time, what we had to do was rely on our writing. We had to describe what was going on. We were given film, and the film would last in a camera like this about 3 minutes, but that covered the whole day. So you basically had maybe 20 seconds of film about a story, so your writing had to be very clear. And by the way, the other thing is, they must have thought news was going to be pretty rough, because my very first day of work, they gave me a hard hat. Said KCPX, that's what our station was at the time. And so when you have a hard hat as your first station issued item, you're in for a long ride.
It's so fun to look back. I appreciate you bringing in those props. Now, for a long time, there were 3 commercial networks and a public network. So what was news gathering like in those days?
We covered a lot of government news. That's one thing that perhaps has changed. We had people at every city commission meeting, we had people at every county meeting and the state. It was a lot of telling people in Utah what was going on in our government. The newscast, I think under today's standards, would be called somewhat boring. And this is no criticism of those wonderful journalists that I worked with then, but it was something that technically we didn't have a lot to work with. So we worked with our minds, we worked with our pens, and we wrote the news, shorter stories, very much to the point. And you usually had about 11 stories in a half-hour newscast, so you had to be Spartan in your writing, but very clear. That's one thing that really has changed.
It's so fun to look back, and you've seen news evolve over the years as we learn more about what viewers want, what stories are important to viewers as well. Craig, what do you view as the critical turning point in the business of local news?
There was one thing that changed across all of country, and that was in 1972, there was Watergate. And once there was Watergate, people wanted to change the world through writing and through journalism. Now, it wasn't a job that you got rich at, and it wasn't a job that had just really cushy hours. And it, of course, still isn't a job with a lot of cushy hours, but you wanted to change the world. Watergate changed it, and technology definitely changed it. Once we could do live news, once that we could do news that we recorded on tape at those times, now we do files on SD cards. That changed it, because now news became instant. And we're talking about 1976, 1977, when we were able to use tape and when we could put up the first very primitive live cameras. That's what changed it in my mind.
Yeah, those were the heydays that continued for years and decades. And as technology began to change with more local stations, cable, the internet, social media, how have you observed local news adapting?
You had to now realize what were you like live. And again, when I mentioned how you had to do writing to start with, now you had to do things like comb your hair, which was never a problem for me, by the way. But you had to look at how you could present the news live. Before, you would just write it out. You could make 3 or 4 copies, but today it is live. So that was one way the news had to adapt. The reporters had to adapt in the newsroom. And then competition. You were right when you said there were 3 stations locally that were network affiliates. There was limited editions on national news. It was a half-hour a night. So the competition was very intense between three people. Well, now what do we have? Maybe 120 places that you can get news. None of them as good as ABC4, of course, but you have so much more competition, and you have to look good. And of course, even then you did. I had my smart little baby blue coat that was given to me too, and you can imagine me standing out there. That's what changed the news. I had that snappy clothes with the silver buttons.
Craig, you've kept that coat in such good condition. I'm so impressed.
You don't ask me to put it on.
Okay.
There is one thing that changed in the reporters, and that is I don't think any of us could put these back on.
I don't think that's a bad thing. Craig, in your opinion, what is the biggest challenge for local broadcasting news?
Ooh, that's quite the question, isn't it? I think it's to remain being relevant, particularly in a place such as Salt Lake City and Utah, which has grown so much. How do you talk about news that affects us all, other than the weather, of course, which affects us all? But how do you make a story that you're covering here be appropriate for somebody who's maybe only been in Utah a year, that doesn't know the backstory on something? That, I think, is our greatest challenge. Like, for example, let's say crime. How do you tell someone, are you going to be safe? Well, that's a big question. And I think, how do you tell somebody, are you going to be economically fit? It's talking to such a mass audience today that doesn't have the backstory of Utah. And I think that's how do you make the news appropriate? How do you make it relevant? It's really the challenge I see.
Craig, about 30 seconds left. Where do you see local news going in the future?
We continue to look for new niches of that news. We began to look, obviously, for example, here at our abc4.com, looking at our apps. That's going to be the future. I hope we still have, in many more years, ABC4 TV. But I think you're going to see certainly the rise of the internet news services like abc4.com.
You've been hearing from Craig Wirth, ABC4's beloved legacy journalist. Craig, thank you so much for your insight tonight. It was great to hear from you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on the state of local broadcast news. Up next in our conversation are Rosie Nguyen, Assistant Professor of Journalism at Salt Lake Community College and founder of Amplify Utah, as well as Scott Pierce, media critic for the Salt Lake Tribune. Thank you both for joining us tonight and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Rosie, let's start with the obvious question. What do you see as the current state of local broadcast news?
Well, I think the current state of broadcast news is very similar to what you see as the state of news generally. It is very much in flux, and we're all still trying to sort it out and figure out exactly what that means. We are committed to the legacy way of doing things, all of the principles and ethics of journalism and doing it well, but we're also layered on with all of these other things that aren't new anymore. You know, digital media is here to stay, folks, and it is constantly changing the way that we do legacy news. So I think that we're constantly adapting. We see different numbers when it comes to revenue. We see different numbers when it comes to viewership. People are torn in a lot of different directions because they have so many places now to go and get their information in their news. So I think that broadcast news is still very much a very viable and important part of the media landscape, but it's shifting and it's requiring we all adapt to it a little bit more quickly and more frequently.
Scott, let's get your take. What do you see as the current state of broadcast news?
Well, I think I agree. I think everybody's still trying to figure it out. Everyone's trying to figure out where to go in, the digital age, in the age of the internet. I think that maybe the biggest change we've seen in what's on the air on local stations is that it is completely local. It isn't that long ago that stations were airing a lot more national news, a lot more international news. You can get that, again, 100 places. There's only, 4 places that you can really get local Utah news on TV.
Rosie, can you talk about the current impact of broadcast news? How does it rank as a source of news, and who is the audience?
Well, I think how it ranks as a source of news depends on the audience. Your younger your younger population, students, people that I teach in my classroom at Salt Lake Community College, are very rarely watching broadcast news at all. If they live at home, maybe their parents are turning on and that's part of their nightly information and news cycle. But for the most part, they could not tell you what's happening in the local media landscape from a broadcast perspective. But I think your older audiences, particularly people in the 60-plus demographic, the people who grew up with the television in their homes, and then various levels into the late 30s. And so we're still turning to broadcast news as their main source of local information. The impact is really broad on that because, as we said earlier, there are just so many places that you can go. So people might be interacting with broadcast news not on television. They could be interacting with it on Facebook or on Twitter, watching Facebook Lives or clips from broadcasts. So those touch points to broadcast news are still there, but the impact is that it might not be on your television set, and that appointment viewing that was kind of the trademark and the hallmark, I guess, of broadcast news in its heyday.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. It used to be that TV or radio or newspaper were the only places that you can get this kind of information, and with the internet and social media, that source has turned into so many different avenues exponentially.
In Utah, there were, KSL was regularly 100 and some odd thousand homes, more than that in earlier years. It was, I've talked to people who anchored at some of the stations back in the day, and when they would do remotes at small towns in Utah, it was a major event. Anchors were celebrities, and those days are gone.
So Scott, can you talk about the media landscape? What has changed in terms of ownership in the past decade or so?
Well, what we think of as local TV is not really so much local. It's really certainly not locally owned. I mean, Channel 4 is owned by Nexstar, which has, almost 200 stations. The biggest station owner in the country. KUTV is owned by Sinclair, which is just a few stations behind. KSTU is owned by Scripps, which has, I've forgotten now, 50, 60, somewhere in there. These are not small companies. Sinclair and Nexstar are enormous companies with enormous clout and enormous reach. Even KSL, I mean, it's the only, Bonneville International is an independent company that owns one TV station and a bunch of radio stations, but it's not as if there isn't a lot of financial backing there too. It's we have local people in each of those stations, but it's directed from huge companies.
Well, and KSL is a power player in the digital world in a way that very, very few other legacy television stations have been able to control. They got in early when the rest of the world was paying attention to Craigslist with classifieds. And on its digital front, it still has KSL. It is still KSL Classifieds. And you go to KSL.com, and even though that's the digital enterprise of it, most people don't realize that it's not KSL TV. So it still has that massive power as a broadcast station, despite it spinning off into this digital component in a very different way.
Marcy, about a minute left. How do stations make money, and has anything changed in the past few years that affects this model?
Well, Scott and I were just having a conversation about this offset. Every year, or every 2 years, Pew Research releases the State of the Media report. And what they found in their 2020 report, which just came out earlier this year, that 2020 was a massive year for revenue and for viewership. And the reason it was such a big year for revenue is, one, a lot of people were home. We were all at home during the global pandemic, making appointment viewing, turning on our television sets when news came on, but also it was an election year. And in 2020, $2 billion was spent in advertising on local television news. So the 4 stations here were a big part of that pie. And that is up from just over $500 million in 2012, which was Obama's second year. That is a massive increase, a $1.5 billion increase in revenue. But we don't expect to see that this year or next year, so it'll be interesting to see what that revenue looks like in 2024 and if it can keep pace with what we saw in this last election year.
All right, Marcy and Scott, hold that thought. We do have to take a quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on the state of local broadcast news. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on the state of local broadcast news. We resume our conversation now with Marcy Young-Cancio, assistant professor at Salt Lake Community College and founder of Amplify Utah, as well as Scott Pierce, media critic for the Salt Lake Tribune. Marcy, let's talk about trust when it comes to the mainstream media. What does the research say about media trustworthiness, and why are some people not trusting media?
That's a big and a really good question. What I find in my classes and just in having conversations with people is that when we say the word media, we often think of cable news. When you hear that word, people automatically think of Fox and CNN and MSNBC, and they're not really thinking about what they get from their local news players like ABC4 and the stations here. And so I think part of that trust comes from the lack of trust, rather, comes from the 24-hour news cycles that have to fill 24 hours of news every single day. And that means pundits yelling at each other. That means a perception of sensational headlines geared at causing fights. And people don't trust that. They want to have good information. They don't want to feel like they're in the middle of like a mud wrestling ring. And so that, I think, has a trickle-down effect on how we trust other local media. And so for me, it's a media literacy component in understanding what your news is offering and understanding the differences between network news and cable news, between network news and local news, and the benefits of that local news. So the trust is big. We could dedicate an entire show to trust. But the big thing is knowing how to read your news and knowing what sources you trust and why you trust them and how to read the messaging that you're getting from them.
I mean, I would also just say real quick that I don't think any of us should be surprised that the credibility of the media has taken a hit, because one of the major outlets for 25 years has been telling its audience that the rest of the media is fake. And you had a president of the United States telling the country that the media is fake. I mean, I completely agree that this is more a national thing, but it trickles down to local news as well.
Right, and we hear that term fake news now becoming a common phrase that's just thrown around, right? Marcy, broadcast was once the primary distribution of news, and now it's the internet. So how are you talking to your students about this change?
Well, when it comes to creating news, to reporting news, I mean, the principles and the tenets say the same. You want to be accurate, you want to be reliable, you want to be truthful, you want to do your research, you want to be able to back it up. That goes regardless of whether you're watching it on your television set in a more legacy format, or if you're getting it on your phone or even on your watch through the internet. So I talk to my students about really respecting those principles, and of course we're adapting and shifting constantly. But when it comes to news, I mean, I'm a firm believer in, the freedom of the press and in the Fourth Estate and what that means to protecting democracies. And so I keep that at the forefront, and then hope that we can figure out all of the pieces to be able to keep delivering good information to audiences through whatever platform that might be.
Scott, how do you see social media sites and the internet affecting how news is produced?
Well, I think it's, there's a parallel that I remember when people were saying that MTV was ruining TV because everything had to be short and quick and all that sort of thing. I think there's some parallel that stories have to be visual, have to be maybe less extensive than they used to be. And I think you can see on local newscasts that there are pieces that can be easily plucked out and run on the websites. We can't ignore the internet. You want people to have a connection with your news crew and with your station, and that's a way to do it.
All right, friends, we've got about a minute left. Marcy, we'll start with you. What's your prediction? Where do you see broadcast local news going over the next 5 to 10 years?
I mean, wow. It's a big question. I mean, I think that broadcast news has been a little more protected in terms of revenue than a lot of the other mediums. Newspapers have been completely slashed. That same State of the Media report from Pew said that for the first time, circulation numbers surpassed that of revenue numbers in newspapers, which says a lot considering circulation has dropped significantly as well. So for broadcast news, it's been a little more insulated. It's still been able to pull money and revenue in a different way. So I think that we will see broadcast news stick around in the way that is familiar for a while to come, but I do think that we'll see it needing to shift. And as to what that looks like, you know, I think there's many ways that it could go.
Scott, let's hear from you. What's your prediction?
Oh, I hate to make predictions. I would never have predicted where we are now 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. I agree that I think that local stations are going to remain a presence for the foreseeable future. I think that, you know, it's going to be tougher and tougher in terms of budgets, but that, you know, my hope is that local news remains, because, you know, you're not going to get local news off cable news networks or you know, most of the internet, and if you do get it, it's not reliable. I think that local TV stations are reliable, and it would be a disservice to the public if they went away.
You've been hearing from Marcy Young-Cancio, Assistant Professor of Journalism at Salt Lake Community College and founder of Amplify Utah, and Scott Pierce, television critic for the Salt Lake Tribune. Thank you both for being a part of this conversation tonight. It was insightful to hear from you.
Thanks for having us.
And don't forget, we would love to hear from you about the show. We invite you to join our Facebook group by searching for ABC4 In Focus, or you can send us an email, infocus@abc4.com.